Welcome to the I-29 Moo U Dairy Podcast. The I-29 Moo University is a consortium of the land-grant universities located in Minnesota, Iowa, South Dakota, and Nebraska. This podcast covers timely news, information, and research for today's dairy industry. Hi, this is Jim Salfer with the I-29 Moo University Group, and today we're doing a podcast, and we're really fortunate to have Peggy Coffeen with us, and she is the host of the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, so I feel a little bit intimidated since she's a professional podcaster, and also my co-host today is Fred Hall with Iowa State University. Welcome, Peggy and Fred.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. And I feel like I'm back among friends because, Jim, you and I have been in the same circles throughout the years in my journalism career. And Fred, we're friends from many years back when I spent the first year of my career out of college in Northeast Iowa. So thanks for having me today, guys.
Well, thank you. So, Peggy, can you tell us a little bit about your background? You touched on just a little bit. So can you just tell us where you came from and what you've been doing over the last few years?
Yeah, you bet. So my background is I grew up on a family dairy farm in southern Wisconsin and went off to pursue ag communications, agriculture journalism as my career. And so after spending that 1 year in Northeast Iowa, where I got to hang out with Fred for a year at the Northeast Iowa Community College and the Dairy Foundation, and Jen Bentley as well, and some of my favorite people, after doing that, I moved back home to Wisconsin and spent the bulk of my career in the agriculture journalism field. So that included about 9 years with Progressive Dairy Magazine, where I was an editor there. And so that's, again, where I was able to cross paths with some pretty amazing people in the dairy industry, producer side, and also those of you like Jim and Fred that are out there every single day dedicating your lives to making it easier and better and possible for dairy farmers to do what they love. So I left Progressive Dairy about a little over a year ago to really pursue my personal passion, and that was really a specific way to meet dairy farmers where they were at with information that could really help them with their business, their management, and their leadership. And that's when I started the Uplevel Dairy Podcast.
Okay, Peg. I know at World Dairy Expo you had a session focusing on dairy leadership and some of the work you've been doing. Do you want to expand on that just a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. So, one of the things that comes up a lot in my conversations with dairy farmers over the years is I would sit down with producers. And, the thing about dairy farmers is, none of them are people that sit around, right? Like none of them are people that are not ever busy. They're always on the go. But sometimes what happens is when you're so busy doing the work that it can be really challenging to take the time to sit down and to plan for the future, to really think ahead about are the actions you're taking every single day really helping you to achieve the goals that you have for your business, for your family, and towards a bigger picture. And so, even as I have become my own business, these are things that I struggle with as well, is being able to take that time and say, okay, I need to work on my business and not just in my business. And I want to make sure that I have a clear vision for the future and that the actions I'm taking every day are getting me to where I want to be. And that's the same thing that dairy farmers want too, is you want to know that you're not just spinning your wheels, that you are actually getting traction and taking the right strategic actions to get where you want to be in your business. And so that's where I came up with this opportunity where the National Milk Producers Federation and their Young Cooperators program, they came to me and were looking for something to really add value to that Young Cooperators group. And I suggested this activity, which is 8 questions for outlining your vision and gaining traction to be able to get there. And it is based on a book called Traction by an author named Gino Wickman. And this is a concept that businesses all over the world are using to be successful in their teams and in their management and in their strategy. But it's also some principles that some of the consultants that I've had as guests on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, they're using them with some of the dairy businesses that they're working with too.
Oh, well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that, Peggy. So what are some of the things that they said, or why don't you walk through what these vision is and the traction?
So, Jim, it was this this model of 8 questions for moving your dairy farm forward that I was able to bring forth in a session at World Dairy Expo for the NMPF Young Cooperators Group. And so within that session, I was also able to bring in 3 young cooperator members, 3 producers from there, actually each from Wisconsin. And what we did is we sat down ahead of time and we walked through these 8 questions together, and then they presented that. And so it was really interesting to hear what they had to say about how they answered these 8 questions for moving their dairy farm forward. So those producers were Laura Rotz, who's with Wagner Family Farms up in the Oconto Falls, Wisconsin area. Paul Lippert, who's a young dairyman in Pittsville, Wisconsin, milks about 600 cows at Grass Ridge Farms. And then the third one was Nathan Weiss. And Nathan is from West Rosendale, and he and his mom and dad milk about 200 cows on their dairy farm there. So 3 different perspectives, 3 different producers, 3 different sizes, but a lot of the answers to their questions all came back to some pretty similar principles.
And how this program or what you're trying to educate people on works.
Yeah, so there's, again, these 8 questions that play into vision and traction. And vision is all about strategic thinking about where you are headed with your business. And traction are the strategic actions that match up to that vision so that you can be confident that the efforts you're putting in every day are focused and targeted toward where you actually want to go. And so when we look at these 2 pieces from the Vision Traction Organizer, again, from this resource called Traction, we're looking at the vision first. And there's 5 of the 8 questions that play into the vision. And it starts with core values. So it's simply sitting down and getting out of your head and onto paper and writing out what are your core values. And so as I talked with these producers, we identified core values that they had. And then the next step was to also identify their core focus. And core focus was all about where are you putting your emphasis in your business and what's driving the engine of your business. The third question is, what's your 10-year target? And that 10-year target is really your bigger picture. Like, what are you doing all of this work for? Like, if you're a dairy farmer, you are putting in the hours, you are putting in the time, you are putting in 110%, if not more, because I know how dairy farmers are. And so what are you working toward? What is your bigger picture? And that's what that 10-year target really comes back to. And then the fourth question that's part of the vision is, what's your marketing strategy? How are you differentiating yourself in the marketplace? And also with dairy farmers, what we also talked about here too is, how are you protecting your profitability in that marketing segment? And then the third question with vision is, we talked about the 10-year picture, but looking at the 3-year vision. What does your farm look like 3 years from now? And so that was the first 5 questions of the vision and traction. And then the traction piece is really these 3 questions. It's looking at what's your 1-year plan, and then breaking that out into your quarterly rocks. So like, what are the things that you need to accomplish in the next 90 days to get you toward your 1-year goal? And that builds into the 3-year picture and the 10-year target. And then the third question, under traction, which is the 8th of the 8 questions for moving your dairy farm forward, is what are your issues? And when I say issues, what I really mean by that is, what could get in the way? What are the things that could get in the way of taking your business the direction that you want to go? And I say all these things with the frame of reference of business because, I think sometimes with dairy farming, and, because I grew up on a dairy farm, and even just having, my own business as well, is we put so much passion in the work that we do. We love what we do, but at the end of the day, we have to look at it from the perspective and in the lens as a business if we want to be successful, profitable, and sustainable. And so, these are the 8 questions for moving your dairy farm forward.
Yeah, we've done a program for a few years now called Planning Your Dairy Farm Future. It's not exactly the same, but it's kind of, some of the pieces are somewhat the same. And I don't know what your experience has been, Peggy, but our experience has been, I guess I'm really surprised how much interest the farms have in this. Some of the farms, especially ones that want to move their farm forward and they know they can't stay the same as they are now. Because as you mentioned, I think farmers don't get into farming because they like discussing vision and traction. That's kind of what you had mentioned. They just don't. They get into it because they like cows, they like to work on equipment, and they like to talk about genetics. So what's been your experience in working with farmers with this, or where are you going with this whole concept of this vision and traction and working with farms?
So what I find, Jim, and this is going to line exactly up with what you just shared and reinforce that is, if you're to sit down with a dairy farmer and say, hey, what would you rather spend your day doing? Strategic thinking and strategic planning, or going out and doing the work? Right. And I think sometimes, and I find this even in my own business, and I relate it back to having grown up on a dairy where we did the work and you love the work, is we find so much joy in doing the work and so much satisfaction in doing the work. But sometimes the work that we need to do is making sure that the energy and effort we're putting in is actually moving us forward and not just, getting in a place where we're stuck or spinning our wheels, but to really look at the actions we're taking every day and say, are these the right actions for where we want to go? And, and that's the bigger envelope that I'm pushing here and bringing into perspective. And, a lot of it goes back, as I mentioned, to this helping me in my own business. This is a model I've used for my podcasting business. It's a model that I know other dairies and businesses all over the world are using to really just hit that pause button and go back to, the idea of like getting what's in your head onto paper. And there's so much power in that because like, Jim, I'm sure when you've had conversations with these business planning and dairy farm future planning, how many people do you have this conversation with? And they're like, well, yeah, it's in my head. Like I kind of know, like, does that come up? Do people respond that way when you ask them like, oh, what are your core values? Like, where do you see things going? Is that a response that you get?
Yeah, it's very typical. And many of the farms we work with now have, it's a son or daughter, it's a multi-generation farm. Well, as you mentioned, Peggy, it's nice to get it on paper because the different generations and or different partners may not be thinking the same thing. So I think some of the value, and there is value, I think research has clearly shown there's value in writing your thoughts down and developing a plan to move forward. I mean, I think you're exactly right. I mean, the dairy industry, as we all know and all the listeners know, it's moving so fast and changing so rapidly. And if you write things down and then visiting those periodically, I really liked how you laid out a 10-year target versus a 10-year plan. Because I think sometimes some strategic planners say you got to have a plan for the next 10 years. And I think, who even knows I think it's good to have kind of a target where you want to be, but to spend a lot of time writing a plan for 10 years, the chances of that coming to fruition probably isn't right. But I think it's still good to be thinking about that. So I really like the way you laid this out, Peggy.
Well, thank you. And I hope that it helps. I hope it helps farmers think through these things too, because you're right. Like, we know, you and I, Jim, we know, and anyone listening that's in the dairy industry, we know that this industry is changing rapidly and that some of the things that are changing do at times seem like they are outside of our control. There's forces, whether it's in the markets or whether it's in regulatory, there are so many things that affect our ability to do business, but there are some things that we can control. And, that 10-year target, like another way to look at that is what's your finish line? Like, why are you doing what you're doing? And it doesn't mean that you have to have an action item for every year from now to the next 10 years. And maybe 10 years isn't your target. Maybe it's 30 years, maybe it's 5. But like, what is your finish line? Is it that you want to build a business that you can bring a family member into? Is it that you want to be able to retire comfortably and not work on the dairy anymore or not have a dairy anymore? Do you want to position your dairy to be saleable? Those are the types of things that when we think about that 10-year target, what's the life you want 10 years from now? And I think that's one of the, that's something else that's interesting that I'll say as I talk with these young producers, and they're all, like kind of in that 30 to 35, 40-ish range, is every single one of them, they talked about their business, but they always brought in something that reflected their personal life and finding some balance of their personal goals and their family life and what they wanted in their farming business. And I think that is a paradigm that is shifting from the conversations that we used to have, the conversations and the mentality and the lifestyle that I grew up with on a 50 cow dairy, right? Is like the dairy was your lifestyle. Well, now these younger producers, and I think this gives us a little window into a whole shift of another generation that's coming into dairy ownership and management and into the dairy workforce, is they're saying it's not just about the business, it's about the life we want to create. And I don't know, do you see that too, Jim, in the conversations you have?
Yeah, and I would argue that's a really good move. And I think that helps have those conversations. Yeah, when I started an extension 25 years ago, it was not real uncommon for and probably an older farmer that was about retirement age, and it was really a badge of honor to not have missed a milking in 25 or 30 years. And young people, and I think it's good, as you mentioned, Peggy, I don't think we can make our occupation who we are. And I think a lot of those farmers struggle when they retire. So you're exactly right, Peggy. And the other thing about doing this, I think, with having your spouse involved or any other key partners, is you can help understand what their values are. And you're exactly right. As we have some of these meetings, the older generation, some of them will say, I kind of want to back off from management, but I'll help on the farm as much as I can. There was another farmer said, no, I think I want to move. They were talking about moving to Missouri. Now, why Missouri? I don't know. But said, I want to buy a farm down in Missouri and more of a hobby farm and ride horse. And so I think it's really good for the younger generation to hear the older generation describe that. Matter of fact, I had one young generation come up to me and said, I never heard my dad before ever give me an age about when he kind of wanted to slow down. So again, people have this all in their head, but there's a lot of value in writing it down and discussing it with other partners in your business.
And Jim, you just brought up another really great point, is like, this really is an exercise that is for multiple people, leadership, we can call it a leadership team, an ownership team. I know sometimes when we're with our family, we don't always see ourselves as that, but essentially, like, you and the people that you work with and own that dairy with and that make decisions with, you are the leadership team of your dairy. And so these conversations are ones that should be happening with the whole team. And now, but I think if you can at least as an individual challenge yourself to go through this, then you also have something that you can bring to the other people that you are working with every day, whether they're parents, siblings, just other partners in the business. And if you do it, you're leading by example of saying, hey, maybe we've never really talked about these things before, but this is a way of starting to open up the conversation. And, one of the things that I want to emphasize here too is answering these 8 questions. It's not going to be perfect the first time you do it. It's not going to be perfect when you do it yourself. It's going to take some time to really, do this and use it as a directional tool and a compass for your strategic planning by having the critical conversations or having someone else lead them for you and the other people that you do business with on the dairy. Because this can't happen as one person that's doing this in a siloed way. And I think you bring up a good point when you talk about, just having other people involved in those conversations that are the key partners.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes back to, there's some things that even though you may change your directional focus, what you don't change are your core values. And when you start, and I think that's why in this model, core values is question number 1 for your vision, because identifying those core values, and it's not just identifying, but it's choosing to live by them and to do business by them and to operate by them. That's where the power is, right? Of saying, okay, on this dairy, this is how we do things. In this family, this is how we do things. And you hold everyone to that standard. It's how you hire and fire. It's how you choose your partnerships. It's how you make your business decisions. And just having those couple of things that you're like, these are our non-negotiables, no matter what direction you go with, with your future, that it's in alignment with where you want to be as a person and how you want to interact with others and how you want to have your influence in the time you have in this world. It's a bigger picture.
Yeah, I think you're right, Peggy. I always tell people this. I think one of the things people challenge is they're afraid if they write it down, somebody is going to say, 5 years ago you wrote this down. And I always tell people, the whole group, we do this in a group setting, said these are not the 10 Commandments etched in stone. This is paper. And paper can change, and everybody has a right to change their mind. Now, you don't want to do this day to day, but I think life circumstances changed. I think, Peggy, if you would look back at your life 10 or 15 years ago, or I would sure look back at my life 10 or 15 years ago, your priorities kind of change and your vision changes. I've switched jobs a number of times. You switched jobs, Peggy, and part of that, maybe you have it in the back of your mind, we just change over time, and I think farmers have got to accept the fact that they change over time. Peggy, now I'm sure every listener after hearing you is so excited that they want to follow through on this. So what's your thoughts or recommendations, or where can they go from here? If you've piqued their interest, where do you suggest they go? Do you consult one-on-one? Are there organizations that do this? What's your suggestion?
Yeah, so there are people out there that do this sort of thing, but the most basic thing, there's 2 resources that I want to leave with your listeners when it comes to these 8 questions. And one thing that they can do is they can head over to the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, because episode 49 will include this conversation, but it also will include the conversations that those 3 producers, Laura, Paul, and Nathan, shared at World Dairy Expo. So I think one of the best things that I can do as a gift to your listeners is say, here's what 3 other people say, and just use those as an examples to get your head around how other producers are thinking about their future and how they're moving their business forward. And so that will be episode 49 of the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, where they can actually listen to what those 3 producers shared at the Young Cooperators panel for NMPF at World Dairy Expo. And then the other resource is the actual book Traction. And you can even find online, and we can include a link in the show notes here too, Jim, if you're able to do that, for the Vision Traction Organizer. And that's where these 8 questions come from. So even just having that piece of paper in your hand and starting it, you're going to get further than you are today if you just start now. And having a few other producers to be able to listen to and say, okay, they took the time to do this, and this is how they're thinking about the future of their dairy and the way that they're doing things. And I hope that encourages others to just take that action step to do it as well too.
Well, thanks, Peggy. I really appreciate you joining us today on this I-29 podcast. And I think if you're a listener out here, or a dairy farmer out here, I think it sounds a little bit academic, but I think it really is important for all the reasons Peggy had talked about. So with that, Peggy, do you have any closing comments?
Just a pleasure, Jim, to be able to reconnect with you and the extension crew in Minnesota and Iowa. And thank you for having me on your podcast. And would love it if some of your listeners wanted to check out Uplevel Dairy and hopefully find some great additional tips in their arsenal for business leadership and management as dairy farm owners, managers, and advisors.
We'd like to thank our annual sponsors, including our gold sponsor, Iowa Corn Growers Association. Please visit their website at iowacorn.org. We'd also like to thank our silver sponsors, Pioneer, Connor Agri-Service, Diamond V, and Central Vet Clinic. I-29 Moo University is an equal opportunity educator. For the full discrimination statement, visit extension.iastate.edu/diversity/EXT.